At 68 years old, I learned a new word for raising your own flesh and blood: kidnapping. The word was spoken by a man in an expensive suit, a lawyer whose name I'd already forgotten. It hung in the sterile air of the courtroom, ugly and obscene, a stain on the polished wood and the American flag that stood silently in the corner. He said it with such casual cruelty, as if he were describing the weather. An act of kidnapping, he'd declared, gesturing toward me. Carmen Hope Morales, a grandmother from Queens who had spent the last 15 years packing lunches, checking homework, and kissing bruised knees. My crime, he claimed, was stealing the 3 children my own daughter had left on my doorstep like a bag of unwanted groceries. I looked at her then. Rachel, my daughter. She sat beside her lawyer, her posture rigid, her face a mask of practiced sorrow that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was no grief there, only a chilling, predatory stillness. She was dressed in a conservative navy blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly, a costume designed to sell a lie. The lie that she was a mother wronged, a victim searching for her stolen children. The truth was so much simpler and so much uglier. The truth was that she was a vulture who had smelled money. I felt nothing looking at her. No anger, no pain. That part of my heart had died long ago, cauterized by years of silence and abandonment. All that was left was a cold, hard resolve that felt like iron in my bones. The judge, a man named Marcus Holloway, peered down at me over his spectacles. He looked tired, as if he had seen every possible version of human betrayal and was weary of it all. "Mrs. T. Morales," he began, his voice a low rumble, "this is a serious accusation. Your daughter, Ms. Rachel Evans, alleges that you have held her children against her will." He kept talking, but the words became a distant hum. My focus was singular. I wasn't listening to the accusations anymore. I was listening to the beat of my own heart, steady, calm, almost unnervingly slow. My hands, resting on the worn leather handle of my purse, did not tremble. The woman who used to cry, the woman who used to plead, the woman who used to forgive everything she wasn't in this room. They thought they had dragged a weak, sentimental old woman into this arena. They were about to find out how wrong they were. It's funny the things you think about in a moment like this. My private life, my family's story laid bare for everyone to see. It feels like one of those stories you watch online, a drama unfolding for strangers. But before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're really happy to know that our stories have reached people everywhere. The judge paused, waiting for my response. The lawyer for the prosecution smirked, confident. Rachel dabbed at a dry eye with a tissue. The performance was flawless, but I wasn't their audience. Slowly, deliberately, I leaned down and opened my purse. It was the same one I'd carried for years, filled with tissues, reading glasses, and peppermint candies for the boys. But today, it held something else. My fingers bypassed the clutter and closed around the crisp edges of a simple, yellow manila envelope. It wasn't thick, but it was heavy. It carried the weight of 15 years. I pulled it out and placed it on the table before me. It looked so ordinary, so out of place amid the legal binders and glossy files. But it was a testament. It was proof. It was every school registration form, every doctor's bill, every birthday card, every tear, every sacrifice. It was the truth, condensed onto paper. I stood up. My back was straight. My shoulders were squared. I was not the accused. I was a mother. The only mother those boys had ever truly known. I met Judge Holloway's gaze, holding it without flinching. My voice, when I spoke, was not loud, but it filled the silent room. It was clear, steady, and devoid of the hysteria they had expected. "Your Honor," I said, my hand resting on the envelope, "my daughter is a liar." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Rachel's lawyer shot to his feet, sputtering an objection, but I wasn't finished. I pushed the yellow envelope gently across the table toward the court officer. I didn't kidnap anyone. I raised the children my daughter threw away, and everything you need to know, every last piece of the truth, is right here in this envelope. Before the yellow envelope, before the courtroom, before the word kidnapping became a brand on my soul, there was just life. A life I built, brick by painstaking brick, in the quiet hum of Queens, New York. It wasn't a life of grand gestures or dazzling achievements. It was a life of routine, of quiet resilience, of showing up. For decades, I was Carmen Hope Morales, secretary. For decades, my world revolved around the rhythmic click of my keyboard, the steady flow of dictated letters, the gentle scent of coffee brewing in the office break room. It was a modest existence, and I cherished it for its predictability, for the quiet dignity it afforded me in a world that often felt anything but dignified. My own story, the one that led me to that courtroom, began long before Rachel, long before Daniel, Marcus, and David. It began with Richard, my husband. He was a good man, a man who believed in building a future, not just living for the day. We dreamed of a little house, a yard for a dog, the comfortable quiet of shared evenings. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Richard's plans were cut short by a swift, unforgiving illness. One moment he was there, his hand warm in mine. The next he was gone, leaving me with a life suddenly and irrevocably changed. The grief was a raw, gaping wound, but beneath it, a different kind of strength began to bloom. I had to survive, I had to keep going, and I had to do it alone. So I worked. I worked harder than ever before. The small apartment in Queens became my sanctuary, a cozy space filled with the scent of my cooking, the worn pages of my books, and the quiet hum of the city outside my window. It wasn't much a few rooms, a view of brick walls, but it was mine. Every dime I earned, every penny I saved was a testament to my independence, a bulwark against the uncertainty that had threatened to swallow me whole after Richard's death. I learned to make do, to stretch a dollar, to find joy in the simple things. A new book, a warm sweater, the taste of ripe strawberries from the corner market. These were the small treasures that colored my world, a world I had carefully curated for myself. And then there was Rachel, my daughter. From the moment she was born, she was a whirlwind, not a gentle breeze, but a force of nature. Richard had adored her, showering her with the kind of love only a new father could. But when he left us, when it was just the two of us, the dynamic shifted. She became demanding, rebellious. It started subtly, a petulant tone, a refusal to follow simple instructions. As she grew, so did her discontent. She seemed to possess an insatiable hunger, a need for more, always more, that I, with my modest income and simple life, could never seem to satisfy. I did my best. I truly did. I worked overtime. I took on extra sewing jobs on weekends. I sold crafts at local fairs, all to give her the things I thought she needed. A nicer apartment when we outgrew the first one. Clothes that weren't hand-me-downs. The occasional summer camp, which she usually complained about anyway. I wanted her to have a life free from the struggles I had known, a life where she didn't have to worry about where the next meal was coming from or whether the rent would be paid. I believed with every fiber of my being that showing up consistently and without question was the bedrock of family. It was the unspoken contract of love and commitment. Rachel left home at 18, a dramatic exit fueled by a defiant declaration that she needed her own life, her own path, free from my stifling influence. I was heartbroken, of course, but I understood. Young adults need to spread their wings. I told her I would always be there, that my door was always open. She didn't believe me, or perhaps she simply didn't care to. Less than 2 years later, she was back. Not triumphant, not independent, but pregnant. 20 years old and already carrying the weight of a child. The father, like so many others who would drift in and out of her life, was long gone. And then there were the others: Daniel, Marcus, David. 3 boys, each with a different father who, like Rachel's first, vanished into the ether. Each time, Rachel would appear, her belly swollen, her eyes hollow, her promise of a brighter future dissolving into the familiar pattern of abandonment. Each time, I opened my door. Each time, I opened my heart and my home. I couldn't turn away my own grandchildren. I couldn't let them face the same uncertainty, the same feeling of being unwanted that their mother had inflicted upon herself and them. So, I took them in, all 3 of them. My small apartment suddenly felt a lot smaller. While I was navigating the chaos of 3 rapidly growing boys, Rachel kept disappearing. She'd be there for a while, a fleeting presence, then she'd announce she was going away for fun or for work. Sometimes she'd claim she needed space to find herself. I never quite understood what she was looking for because she never seemed to find it. She'd leave for days, sometimes weeks, with no word, no explanation. The boys would ask about her, their little faces etched with confusion and a longing that twisted my heart into knots. I would tell them she was working hard, that she loved them, that she would be back soon. Lies I told to shield them from the harsh reality of their mother's indifference. The day Rachel vanished for good, or at least the day the vanishing act became permanent, was March 15th, 2009. I remember the date as clearly as I remember my own birthday. It was a Tuesday, a cold, damp Tuesday that mirrored the chill that had settled in my bones. Rachel showed up at my door looking thinner than usual, her eyes darting nervously. She held Daniel, Marcus, and David by their small hands. Daniel was 5, Marcus 4, and David a mere toddler of 2. They were her children, but they were also, in many ways, my anchor. "Mom," she'd said, her voice strained, a tremor in it that I, with my years of experience reading her moods, recognized as something more than nerves. "I need you to watch the boys, just for a couple of hours. I have something important to take care of." She smiled, a weak, unconvincing smile. "I'll be back to pick them up before dinner." 2 hours, a simple promise. I nodded, as I always did. I took the boys inside, their little hands still clinging to mine as they followed me into the familiar warmth of my apartment. I made them juice boxes and set them up with their favorite coloring books. I heard Rachel's car pull away. The sound faded into the general hum of the city. I didn't worry. "Just a couple of hours," she'd said. But the hours stretched. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Dinner was prepared, plates were set, and still no Rachel. The boys, initially restless, grew quiet. Their questions about their mother's return became more frequent, more tinged with a dawning anxiety. I reassured them, my own voice starting to sound a little too bright, a little too hollow. I called her phone. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. I called her few friends, the ones I knew, but no one had heard from her. Days turned into weeks. The police were called. They took my statement, their faces impassive, their questions perfunctory. "Any history of mental health issues? Any known associates who might be involved? Has she expressed suicidal tendencies?" I told them everything I knew, which was, in reality, very little. Rachel was a ghost, a mystery even to the woman who had carried her. They filed a missing person report, a bureaucratic step that felt utterly inadequate. Weeks turned into months. The boys stopped asking about her. The hope in their eyes, the little flicker that had once been there, was slowly extinguished, replaced by a quiet resignation. And so, at 53 years old, my life took another sharp turn. I wasn't just Carmen Morales, secretary, grandmother. I was mom. Full-time, 24/7, mom. There was no one else. No husband to share the load, no Rachel to occasionally step in. It was just me and these 3 little souls who looked at me with eyes full of trust, eyes that needed me. The decision, when it finally solidified, was not a conscious choice. but an inevitability. It was the only path forward, the only way to keep them safe, loved, and from falling through the cracks. Quitting my job was the hardest practical decision. 15 years I had worked at that office, a steady, reliable cog in their machine. But I couldn't be in two places at once. I couldn't be at my desk dictating memos and also at home soothing a scraped knee or reading a bedtime story. So I walked into my boss's office, my heart heavy but my resolve firm. I need to resign, I'd told him, my voice surprisingly steady. And he was a good man, he understood. He offered me part-time work, a few hours here and there, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Not for 3 growing boys. The financial strain was immense. My savings, once a comfortable cushion, began to shrink at an alarming rate. The modest apartment suddenly felt impossibly cramped. But I refused to let that define us. I had always been resourceful. If I couldn't rely on a steady paycheck, I would create my own. I dug out my old sewing machine, the one Richard had given me years ago, and started taking in alteration work, hemming pants, mending seams, creating curtains for neighbors. In the evenings, after the boys were asleep, I'd put on my headphones and sew, the steady rhythm of the machine a comforting counterpoint to the silence of the night. I also started cooking for the families in my building, making hearty stews and casseroles, fresh bread, and simple, delicious cakes. It was more work, but it was work I could do on my own schedule, work that brought in a little extra cash, and work that I actually enjoyed. It was a way to feel useful, to contribute, to create something tangible from my efforts. Slowly, painstakingly, we began to carve out our new reality. There were sacrifices, of course. Luxuries became distant memories. Vacations were replaced by park outings and board games. Fancy clothes were replaced by durable, practical wear. But what we lacked in material possessions, we made up for in abundance in other ways. Love, laughter, a deep, abiding sense of security. The boys thrived under my care. They were bright, inquisitive, and full of life. Daniel, the oldest, was my shadow, always eager to help. Marcus, the middle child, was the dreamer, his head often lost in the clouds, and David, the youngest, was the cuddler, his small arms always seeking my embrace. There was a moment, I remember it so vividly, when I realized the shift was complete. It was a cold winter evening, and David, then perhaps 4 years old, had woken up from a bad dream. He'd stumbled into my room, his small face contorted with fear, and crawled into my arms. He'd buried his face in my nightgown, his little body trembling. "Mommy," he'd whispered, his voice thick with sleep and relief. "Mommy, I was scared." And in that instant, as I held him close, stroking his soft hair, it wasn't just a moment of comfort. It was a profound realization. He had called me Mommy, not Rachel, not his absent mother, Mommy, me, Carmen. And in that moment, looking at the 3 little boys who had become my world, I knew that I wasn't just their guardian, their caregiver. I had truly become their mother. The title settled on me. Not with a fanfare, but with a quiet, profound sense of rightness. This was my family now. This was my purpose. But even as I embraced this new role, a part of me, the part that had learned to expect the unexpected, the part that had been hurt too many times, held onto a tiny sliver of caution. Rachel had vanished, but the law, in its infinite wisdom, still recognized her as the mother. What if she decided to return? What if she demanded her children back? The thought was a cold knot in my stomach. So even in the midst of my newfound love and purpose, I started to document. It began subtly at first. I kept the boys' medical bills, their school report cards, the attendance sheets. I saved the little drawings they made for me, the clumsy crayon portraits of a smiling woman with graying hair who they called Mom. Each medical record, each permission slip signed by me, each teacher's note praising their progress. They were not just memories. They were pieces of evidence, evidence of my commitment, my presence, my unwavering love. I stored them carefully, in folders, in boxes, in the back of closets. It was a small insurance policy, a quiet preparation for a storm I hoped would never come, but that I, with the wisdom of experience, knew might just be gathering on the horizon. It was a testament to the fact that I was not just a temporary guardian, I was their foundation. I was the one who stayed. The years that followed my silent vow were a blur of beautiful, ordinary moments. The world outside might have seen a struggling, aging woman raising 3 boys on a shoestring budget, but inside the walls of our small apartment, we were building an empire of love and stability. The boys grew, not just in height, but in character. Daniel, my eldest, developed a quiet, steady sense of responsibility that reminded me so much of Richard. He was the protector, the one who made sure his younger brothers finished their homework and did their chores. Marcus, my middle child, was the artist, the dreamer. He saw the world in colors and shapes I could only imagine, his notebooks filled with sketches of superheroes, fantastical creatures, and most often, our little family. David, my youngest, remained the heart of our home. He had a sensitivity that was both a strength and a vulnerability, a deep well of empathy that made him the first to offer a hug when he sensed I was tired or worried. They were good boys. They were my boys. The ghost of their mother faded with each passing year, replaced by the vibrant reality of scraped knees, basketball games, parent-teacher conferences, and the constant comforting chaos of a house full of life. The title of mom was no longer a substitute, it was my identity, earned through 1,000 sleepless nights and 1,000,000 tiny acts of love. My collection of documents, the yellowed report cards, the faded medical receipts, the crayon drawings grew in a box in my closet, a quiet chronicle of our life together. It was my secret insurance, my silent testament kept just in case. For a long time, I almost forgot why I was keeping it. Our life felt so real, so permanent, that the threat of Rachel's return seemed like a distant, improbable nightmare. But as Daniel approached his 18th birthday, a new kind of anxiety began to prickle at the edges of my peace. Legally, the boys were still Rachel's children. I was their grandmother, their caregiver. But in the eyes of the law, I was a custodian, not a parent. The thought that she could, in theory, reappear and disrupt the stable world we had built sent a chill down my spine. It was no longer just about my own heartbreak. It was about protecting the young men my boys had become. I needed to know. I needed to have a final answer, to close the book on the mystery of Rachel, not for my own peace of mind, but for their legal security. So after years of pushing the thought away, I made a decision. I took a portion of my meager savings money I had painstakingly set aside for a new stove, and I hired a private investigator. His name was Frank, a former NYPD detective with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I sat in his cramped, dusty office, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and told him the whole story, my voice never wavering. I gave him Rachel's last known information, a faded photograph, and the sliver of hope I didn't even realize I was still carrying. Frank was methodical. He made no promises. "These things can take time, Mrs. Morales," he'd warned, "and sometimes you don't like what you find." "I'm not looking for something to like," I told him, my voice firm. "I'm looking for the truth." The wait was agonizing. Every phone call made my heart leap into my throat. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. I began to think it was a waste of money, that Rachel had simply vanished off the face of the earth. Then, one rainy afternoon, Frank called. "I found her, Carmen," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She's in Scottsdale, Arizona." I sat down heavily on my kitchen chair, the receiver cold against my ear. Arizona. It felt like another planet, but that was only the beginning. The truth, when Frank laid it all out for me, was far colder and crueler than I could have ever imagined. Rachel wasn't lost. She wasn't struggling. She hadn't been the victim of some terrible fate. She had been living a whole other life, a life built on a foundation of lies. She was married to a man named Robert Vasquez and had been going by the name Rebecca Stone. Together, they were running a series of small-time insurance scams, preying on the elderly and vulnerable. She had built a new identity, a new reality, all while her 3 sons were growing up without her, just a few states away. But the final detail was the one that shattered the last microscopic shard of hope in my heart. "The most important thing you need to know, Carmen," Frank said, his voice softening for the first time, "is that she knew. She knew exactly where you and the boys were this whole time. We found records of online searches, public database lookups for your address, for the boys' schools. She's been watching from a distance. She just never cared enough to come back." When I hung up the phone, I didn't cry. The capacity for that kind of pain had been burned out of me long ago. A profound, icy calm settled over me. She hadn't been lost. She had been hiding. She hadn't been a victim. She had been a predator, waiting. And in that moment, I finally understood. My daughter wasn't a lost soul. She was a monster. I took Frank's detailed report, filled with addresses, aliases, and evidence of her fraudulent life, and I placed it at the very top of the box of documents. The just in case had arrived. Life continued. The boys grew into fine young men. Daniel went to college for engineering, Marcus to art school, and David began his studies in pre-med. They were my pride, my joy, the living proof that love, not blood, is what truly builds a family. The knowledge of Rachel's existence was a heavy secret, but one I kept to protect them. There was no reason to wound them with the truth of a mother who had chosen to abandon them so completely. The trigger, the event that finally brought the monster out of the shadows, came a week after Daniel's 23rd birthday. A certified letter arrived, addressed to him. It was from the estate of his biological father, a man he had never known. The man, it turned out, had passed away years ago, but had maintained a life insurance policy with his son as the sole beneficiary. The payout was $150,000. It was a staggering sum, a life-changing amount of money that could give Daniel the kind of start I had only ever dreamed of for him. We were shocked, but overjoyed. It felt like a blessing from a ghost, a final, kind act from a man who had otherwise been absent. 1 week later, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find her standing there. Rachel. She was older, of course, thinner. Her hair was a different color, and she was dressed in expensive clothes that looked alien on her. But her eyes were the same, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. She smiled, a practiced, brittle thing. "Mom," she said, as if 15 years hadn't passed, "I'm back." My blood ran cold. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The timing was too precise, too perfect. This wasn't a mother returning out of love. This was a scavenger who had smelled a kill. The boys were home for Sunday dinner. Their reactions were a wall of polite, confused ice. They didn't know this woman. They saw a stranger who claimed to be their mother, her eyes filled with crocodile tears as she spun a well-rehearsed tale of hardship, of being lost, of fighting every day to get back to her babies. I stood by, silent, watching the performance. I saw the way her eyes flickered toward Daniel, the way she assessed him, not as a son, but as a prize. This wasn't about love, it was about money. Daniel's money. That night, after she left with a promise to reconnect and make things right, I knew I had to move. The storm had finally broken. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the best family law attorney I could find, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria Sanchez. The second was to Frank, the investigator. I sat in Ms. Sanchez's office and laid out everything. 15 years of abandonment, the investigator's report, the insurance scams, the sudden reappearance a week after Daniel inherited a fortune. I pushed the box of documents across her polished desk. She listened intently, her expression growing harder with every detail. She's going to file for custody. or at least guardianship to get control of his finances, Ms. Sanchez said, her voice grim. She'll paint you as an old woman who overstepped, who's trying to manipulate him. We have to be smarter. What do we do? I asked, my voice steady. Ms. Sanchez looked at me, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. You've already done the hard part, Carmen. You kept the proof. Now we set a trap. She thinks you're a weak, emotional old woman. We let her keep thinking that. From this moment on, every time you speak with her, I want you to record it. Every phone call, every meeting. Let her talk. Let her believe she's winning you over. Let her hang herself with her own words. It was a cold, calculated strategy, but I felt no hesitation. The part of me that was a mother to Rachel was long dead. Now I was a protector. A warrior defending my territory and my young. The first call came 2 days later. Following my lawyer's instructions, I put the phone on speaker and pressed record. I made my voice sound weak, hesitant, filled with the confusion and hurt Rachel expected. I just don't understand, Rachel, I said, my voice trembling slightly. After all this time, her own voice was syrupy sweet, dripping with false sympathy. I know, Mom. It's so much to take in, but I'm here now. I want to help, especially with Daniel. That's a lot of money for a young man to handle. He needs his mother to guide him. There it is, I thought, my heart like a stone. I don't know, I feigned. He's very responsible. Of course he is, because you did a wonderful job, she purred. But legally, I'm still his mother. I can help him manage his assets. Make sure no one takes advantage of him. I'm just trying to protect him. Over the next few weeks, the calls continued. Each one was a masterpiece of manipulation, and each one was recorded. I played the part of the confused, heartbroken mother, and Rachel, arrogant and blinded by greed, walked right into the cage I had so carefully and so quietly built for her. She revealed everything. Her plan to file a petition to be named Daniel's financial conservator, her intention to invest his money for him, her disdain for my role in their lives. In one particularly damning call, her fake sympathies slipped, revealing the venom beneath. Look, she'd snapped, her voice hard. You've had them for 15 years. You played house. It's my turn now. That money is his birthright, which means it's my right to oversee it. A judge will see that. But I knew something she didn't. A judge would see much, much more. She thought she was building a case against me. In reality, she was writing her own verdict, one recorded word at a time, adding the final, crucial pieces of evidence to my old yellow envelope. The day Rachel officially filed the court petition was the day the quiet war turned public. The documents were a work of fiction, a masterpiece of deceit. In her version of reality, she was the grieving mother who had been tragically separated from her children, a victim who had spent 15 years fighting to get back to them. I was painted as the manipulative matriarch, an aging grandmother who had cunningly isolated the boys, turning them against their rightful parent to maintain control. The inheritance, she claimed, was the only reason she had finally been able to afford the legal help to reclaim her stolen family. It was so audacious, so completely inverted from the truth that it was almost breathtaking. Reading her sworn statement, I felt a strange sense of detachment. The woman described in those pages wasn't me. The story wasn't ours. It was a fantasy she had constructed to justify her greed, and she was betting everything on a judge believing it. Ms. Sanchez and I sat in her office, the petition lying between us. She had read it with a grim, focused intensity. "She's good," my lawyer admitted, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the page. "She's woven a narrative that hits all the right notes. A mother's love, financial hardship, a desperate search. Without proof to the contrary, she'd have a decent chance." "But we have the proof," I said. It wasn't a question. A slow, confident smile spread across Ms. Sanchez's face. "Oh, Carmen," she said, her voice dropping with satisfaction. "We have more than proof. We have an arsenal." That's when we assembled the yellow envelope. It wasn't just a collection of documents anymore. It was the story of our lives, the irrefutable truth meticulously organized into a weapon. We didn't just gather the evidence, we curated it, arranging it to dismantle Rachel's fantasy piece by piece. Each item was a bullet aimed directly at the heart of her lies. First, the visual history. We compiled a thick album of photographs, a vibrant timeline spanning 15 years. There I was, holding a newborn David in the hospital. There I was, beaming at Daniel's kindergarten graduation, his oversized cap slipping over his eyes. There I was, teaching Marcus how to ride a bike, my hand steady on the back of his seat. Birthdays, holidays, first days of school, lazy summer afternoons in the park I was in, every single one. Rachel was nowhere to be seen. It was a powerful, silent testament to presence versus absence. Next came the paper trail of our lives, the bureaucratic proof of my role, medical records for every cold, every broken bone, every vaccination, all signed by me as the responsible party. School documents from elementary registration to high school transcripts, listing me as the primary guardian. Report cards I had signed, permission slips I had filled out, teacher commendations addressed to me. It was a mountain of mundane paperwork that, when viewed together, told an undeniable story. I was the one who had cared for their bodies, their minds, their futures. Then came the audio recordings, the crown jewels of our counterattack. We transcribed the most damning excerpts from my phone calls with Rachel, her cold admission that she needed to guide Daniel's money, her condescending dismissal of my role, calling it playing house, her arrogant assertion that it was her turn now. Hearing her own words stripped of their manipulative charm and laid bare on the page was chilling. It was the voice of a predator, not a mother. We added Frank's entire investigation file. The report was a clinical, brutal takedown of the Rebecca Stone persona. It detailed the insurance scams in Arizona, complete with sworn affidavits from 2 of her victims. It documented her marriage to Robert Vasquez, a man with his own minor criminal record. Most importantly, it included the digital forensic evidence showing her periodic online searches for our names and address over the years. This single piece of evidence vaporized her narrative of a desperate search. She hadn't been searching for them. She'd been monitoring them. But there was one final devastating piece of the puzzle that even I hadn't fully understood until Ms. Sanchez had Frank investigate it further. I had always known that on the day Rachel vanished, a few things had gone missing from my apartment. A small amount of cash I kept in a kitchen jar, and more painfully, 2 pieces of my late mother's jewelry, a delicate gold locket and a pair of sapphire earrings. At the time, in the chaos and heartbreak of her disappearance, I had pushed the thought aside. Unable to believe she would do something so cruel, I told myself I must have misplaced them. Frank, with his detective's instincts, hadn't let it go. He had painstakingly cross-referenced pawn shop records in Queens from the weeks following March 15, 2009, and he found it. A transaction record from a dingy shop 3 towns over, dated the very afternoon Rachel left. The items pawned, 1 gold locket and 1 pair of sapphire earrings. The name on the slip was Rachel Evans. The shop, miraculously, still had grainy security camera photos from that day archived. There she was, my daughter, her face tight and nervous, sliding my mother's legacy across the counter for a handful of cash before she disappeared. It was proof of theft. It was the final, ugly nail in the coffin of her lies. She hadn't just abandoned her children, she had robbed me on her way out the door. When Ms. Sanchez laid the pawn shop photos on the table, I finally let out the breath I felt I'd been holding for 15 years. The last shred of doubt, the last vestige of the mother who had loved the little girl Rachel once was, finally died. I looked at the grainy image of my daughter, and I felt nothing but a profound, cleansing finality. The day of the hearing arrived. I walked into the courtroom, the yellow envelope in my purse, my heart steady. The boys were there, sitting in the front row. They were no longer children to be shielded. They were men, and they had insisted on being there to support me. They knew the truth. I had sat them down and told them everything, from the investigator's report to the recordings. The pain in their eyes was real, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective loyalty that gave me more strength than they could ever know. Rachel, on the other side of the room, looked confident. She smiled her sad, practiced smile at the judge. Her lawyer began, his voice smooth and compelling, painting the picture of a mother's undying love. I listened, my face impassive, as he detailed her fabricated 15-year struggle. When it was our turn, Ms. Sanchez didn't begin with an argument. She began with a simple request. Your Honor, before we proceed, we would like to call 3 witnesses, Daniel, Marcus, and David Evans. A flicker of panic crossed Rachel's face. This was not part of her plan. One by one, my boys took the stand. Daniel went first. He was 23, a man, but as he looked at me, I could still see the 5-year-old boy I had comforted so long ago. He spoke clearly, his voice resonating with conviction. For 15 years, he began, looking directly at the judge, I have had a mother. She is sitting right over there. He pointed at me. She taught me how to be a man. She taught me about responsibility, about honor, about what it means to show up for the people you love. This woman, he said, his gaze finally shifting to Rachel, is a stranger to me. My real mother is the woman who raised me, and I will not allow this stranger to control my life or slander the only parent I have ever known. Marcus was next. He was quieter, more artistic. He told the court about the time he'd had pneumonia as a child, how for a week I had never left his side, sleeping in a chair by his bed, holding a cool cloth to his forehead, reading to him until his fever broke. Love isn't a word, he said, his voice soft but firm. It's an action. My mother showed me what love is every single day. I have no memory of this woman doing anything for me except leaving. Finally, it was David's turn, my youngest. He didn't have a speech prepared. Instead, he carried a framed drawing to the witness stand. It was a piece he had done in high school, a collage of moments. In the center was a portrait of me, but surrounding it were smaller images. Me tying his shoe, me helping him with a model airplane, me cheering from the sidelines of a soccer game, me holding him when he cried. He held it up for the judge to see. The title, written in careful, elegant script at the bottom, was simply, My Mother. This is my mother, David said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at me. She is my past, my present, and my future. This other person is just the woman who gave birth to me. By the time David stepped down, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted entirely. The judge's weary expression was gone, replaced by one of intense focus. Rachel's composure had cracked. Her face was pale, her hands twisting in her lap. That was when I took the stand. I placed the yellow envelope on the ledge before me, and piece by piece, as Ms. Sanchez guided me, we unveiled the truth. The photos, the school records, the investigator's report, the pawn shop receipts. Finally, we played the audio recordings. Rachel's cold, greedy voice filled the silent courtroom. She visibly flinched, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust. When the last recording ended, I looked at the judge. Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and strong, I didn't kidnap my grandchildren. I saved them. I loved them. I raised them. And that woman, I said, finally allowing myself to point a trembling but determined finger at my daughter, only came back because my son has money. She is not a mother. She's a thief. The silence that followed my final words was absolute. It was a heavy, profound quiet, broken only by the rustle of papers as the court officer collected the last of our evidence. The audio of Rachel's voice still seemed to hang in the air, an ugly echo of her greed. She sat frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The mask of the grieving mother had been ripped away, revealing the snarling, cornered animal beneath. Her lawyer, who had begun the day with such polished confidence, now looked pale and flustered, shuffling his notes as if they might offer some escape. There was none. The truth, once unleashed, was a relentless force. Judge Holloway removed his glasses and polished them slowly with a small cloth. He took his time, his gaze sweeping over the evidence laid out before him. The vibrant album of our family's life, the cold, hard facts of the investigator's report, the damning pawnshop photos, and the transcripts of Rachel's own words. He looked at my boys who sat together, a united front of quiet strength. He looked at Rachel, whose facade had completely crumbled. And finally, his eyes rested on me. For the first time, I didn't see a judge looking at a defendant. I saw a man looking at a mother. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the dispassionate drone of the court, but the clear, firm tone of a man who had reached an undeniable conclusion. "In my 20 years on this bench," he began, his eyes fixed on Rachel, "I have seen a great many disputes. I have seen anger, sadness, and misunderstanding. But rarely have I witnessed such a calculated and cruel perversion of the concept of motherhood." He picked up the investigator's report. The petitioner, Ms. Evans, claims she spent 15 years searching for her children. This court has been presented with irrefutable evidence that not only is this claim false, but that Ms. Evans was fully aware of her children's whereabouts and made a conscious, continuous choice to remain absent from their lives. She did not lose her children, she abandoned them. He then gestured toward the financial documents and the pawnshop receipt. The evidence further suggests that this abandonment was not merely an act of neglect, but was punctuated by an act of theft against the very woman who stepped in to care for her children. And her reappearance, timed within days of her son inheriting a significant sum of money, speaks to a motive that has nothing to do with maternal love and everything to do with avarice. Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling Rachel's fantasy world. She began to shake her head, a low, guttural sound of protest escaping her lips. The judge's gaze hardened. "But the most compelling testimony," he continued, his voice resonating with authority, "did not come from any document. It came from those 3 young men." He looked over at Daniel, Marcus, and David. Their statements paint a clear, unambiguous picture. They were not kidnapped. They were raised. They were nurtured. They were loved. The law recognizes the biological tie, but this court, and any decent human being, recognizes that parenthood is not an event of conception. It is a lifetime of action. It is a commitment. It is showing up. He put his glasses back on and looked directly at Rachel. The finality in his tone was chilling. Therefore, the petition filed by Ms. Evans is denied in its entirety. Custody and guardianship of these men, though they are now adults, is affirmed to have been properly and lovingly executed by their grandmother, Mrs. Carmen Morales. Furthermore, he said, his voice dropping to an ironclad register, this court cannot ignore the evidence of criminal activity presented here. The allegations of insurance fraud in Arizona, combined with the clear evidence of theft and financial manipulation, warrant further investigation. I am referring this entire case file to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution on charges of grand larceny and family fraud. A gasp went through the courtroom. Rachel shot to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice raw and ugly. "They're my children. It's my money." "Order," the judge commanded, his voice booming. 2 bailiffs moved swiftly toward her. Her lawyer tried to restrain her, but she shoved him away. The fight was over. The game was up. And in her panic, her true self was on full display for everyone to see. As the bailiffs took her arms, her wild, hate-filled eyes found mine across the room. There was no remorse, no sadness. There was only the impotent fury of a predator whose prey had not only escaped, but had turned and fought back. and just like that, it was over. The storm had passed. As they led Rachel out of the courtroom, a new, quiet chapter of our lives began. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, but they happened at a distance. Rachel was charged, and given the mountain of evidence, she accepted a plea bargain rather than face a jury. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison for theft, fraud, and a litany of other charges stemming from her life in Arizona. The name Rebecca Stone was gone, leaving only the tarnished reality of Rachel Evans, inmate. For us, it was a time of quiet rebuilding. The first thing the boys did, with a solemnity that brought tears to my eyes, was go to the courthouse and legally change their last names. They were no longer Evans. They were Daniel, Marcus, and David Morales. It was their ultimate declaration, a final severing of a tie that had only ever brought them pain, and an embrace of the name that had meant home, safety, and love. With his inheritance, Daniel didn't buy a fancy car or a flashy apartment. The first thing he did, in consultation with his brothers, was buy me a house. It wasn't a mansion, just a small, lovely brick home in Forest Hills with a little garden in the back. "No more sewing to make the rent, Mom," he'd told me, his eyes shining. "It's our turn to take care of you." And they did. They moved me in, each of them taking a room to paint and furnish. They established a new tradition. Every Sunday, without fail, was for family dinner at my house. They would arrive in the early afternoon, filling the quiet rooms with their laughter, their stories, their lives. Daniel, who became a successful civil engineer, would always check on the house, fixing a leaky faucet or a squeaky door. Marcus, whose art began to sell in local galleries, filled the walls with his beautiful paintings, turning our home into a vibrant museum of our love. And David, on his path to becoming a doctor, would fuss over me, checking my blood pressure and making sure I was taking my vitamins. They had become the men I had always known they would be: kind, responsible, and deeply devoted. Years passed. The quiet, peaceful years I had once only dreamed of became my reality. The little garden in my backyard flourished under my care. I had time to read, to walk in the park, to simply be. The weight of constant struggle had been lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. One autumn afternoon, Daniel came to dinner with a shy, lovely young woman named Sarah, and a year later, I found myself sitting in the front pew at their wedding. As the mother of the groom, I was asked to give a speech at the reception. Standing before all their friends and family, my heart full to bursting, I looked at my 3 sons, my beautiful daughter-in-law, and the life we had built from the ashes of abandonment. Family, I began, my voice clear and steady, is a word we use a lot. We talk about blood ties, about the people we're born to, but I've learned that's not the whole story. Family isn't about who you share blood with. It's about who you share your life with. It's about who shows up. It's about who stays when everyone else leaves. Blood didn't build my family. Love did. Resilience did. Forgiveness did not for those who hurt us, but for the life we thought we'd lost. We built this family with our own hands, with our own hearts. A letter from Rachel had arrived from prison a few weeks before the wedding. It was filled with pleas for forgiveness, with claims of rehabilitation. I gave it to the boys, letting them decide. Together, they chose not to reply. Their life had moved on. Their wounds had healed into scars, and they felt no need to reopen them for a woman who was, to them, a ghost. Their forgiveness was in the lives they built, lives free of her poison. As I ended my speech, I looked out at the joyful faces and felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. My story, our story, had begun with the sharp, bitter pain of betrayal. It had been a long, hard road, paved with sacrifice and silent tears, but it hadn't ended there. It ended here, in a room filled with light and laughter. It ended with freedom. It ended with my boys, my legacy, my heart. It ended with love. And I, Carmen Hope Morales, stood proudly in the center of it all, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a mother, finally and completely at peace. The years that followed Daniel's wedding settled into a rhythm of such profound and gentle peace that it felt like a gift I had waited my entire life to receive. The small brick house in Forest Hills became more than a home. It was a sanctuary, a living monument to the family we had forged in the fire. My garden, once a small patch of dirt, blossomed under my patient care. I learned the names of flowers I'd never had time to notice before: peonies, hydrangeas, lavender. Tending to the earth became a quiet meditation, a way of nurturing life that asked for nothing in return but sunlight and water. Each bloom felt like a small victory, a splash of color against the memory of gray, difficult years. The Sunday dinners became the sacred, unshakable center of our week. The house would fill with the rich aroma of roasting chicken and the boisterous, overlapping voices of my boys. They were men now, truly. Daniel's engineering firm was thriving, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that always made my heart swell. Marcus, my dreamer, had married a kind, intelligent woman named Elena, a gallery curator who championed his art with a fierce and loving pride. His paintings, once confined to notebooks, now hung in galleries in Soho, his unique vision of the world finally being seen and celebrated. And David, my compassionate David, was finishing his residency, his long, grueling hours at the hospital tempered by the deep satisfaction of healing others. He was going to be a fine doctor, the kind who saw patients, not just symptoms. They would arrive, shedding their city stress at the door, and for a few hours they were just my boys again. They'd argue about sports, tease each other mercilessly, and then work together in the kitchen as if they were still teenagers in our tiny Queens apartment. I would sit in my favorite armchair, a cup of tea in my hands, and just watch them. I would watch the easy camaraderie, the unconditional love that flowed between them, and know with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I had done my job. We had won. The war was over. The greatest joy, however, was yet to come. It arrived on a crisp spring Sunday, when the first daffodils were pushing through the soil in my garden. Daniel and Sarah sat everyone down after dinner, their faces alight with a nervous, brilliant excitement. Sarah's hand rested on her stomach as Daniel announced, "Mom, you're going to be a great-grandmother." The explosion of joy in the room was pure, unadulterated light. My boys were cheering, hugging their brother, welcoming Sarah into the next stage of our family's journey. And I was speechless. A great-grandmother. The title felt ancient, magnificent. It was a word that spoke of lineage, of continuation, of a future I had once been too afraid to even imagine. It was the ultimate proof that the branch of our family, which had been so brutally shaken, had not broken. It had grown stronger, and now it was putting forth new life. I held Sarah's hands in mine, my own eyes welling with tears, and saw not just a baby, but a legacy of love that had conquered the darkness. Then, just as we were floating on this cloud of happiness, a shadow from the past threatened to drift across our sunlit world. The news came not with a bang, but a quiet, bureaucratic notice delivered to Miss Sanchez's office and forwarded to me. Rachel was being released from prison. Parole. Good behavior. The words felt like a cruel joke. 5 years had passed, and the system had deemed her ready to re-enter the world. I told the boys that evening, my voice calm and even. I did not want my fear to become theirs. Their reactions were a predictable storm. Daniel's face hardened, his protective instincts flaring. "She is not coming anywhere near you, or Sarah, or this baby," he stated, his voice a low growl. "I'll get a restraining order. I'll do whatever it takes." Marcus was quieter, his anger turning inward. He just shook his head, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "She doesn't exist," he said flatly. "As far as I'm concerned, she died 15 years ago." David, my sensitive soul, was the most visibly unsettled. He said nothing, but I saw the old flicker of pain in his eyes, the shadow of the little boy who had once wondered why his mother had left. It was a reminder that while wounds can heal, the scars remain, and they can ache when the weather changes. I looked at my 3 sons, my fierce protectors, and my heart ached with love for them. "Listen to me," I said, my voice cutting through their anger and anxiety. "She has no power over us anymore. The locks have been changed, legally and emotionally. She cannot touch our finances. She cannot claim any rights. She has no entry into this life we have built. We are safe. All she has is the power we give her. And we will give her none." My calm seemed to soothe them, anchoring them back to the present, to the reality of their strength. We were no longer the victims she had left behind. We were the family that had thrived in her absence. A few months later, my great-granddaughter was born. They named her Hope, Carmen Hope Morales II. When Daniel placed her in my arms, a tiny, perfect bundle wrapped in a soft pink blanket, the world outside the hospital room simply melted away. I looked down at her small, trusting face. Her impossibly tiny fingers curled around my own, and I felt the circle complete. All those years ago, raising my boys, my own hope had been a desperate, flickering candle in a storm. Now it was this, a living, breathing, beautiful new life, a promise, a future. In that moment, holding little Hope, the shadow of Rachel seemed to fade into utter insignificance. Life settled back into its peaceful rhythm, now punctuated by the sweet gurgles and happy cries of a baby. Hope became the new sun around which our family happily orbited. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a package arrived. It was a small brown paper-wrapped box, left on my doorstep. There was no return address, but the postmark was from a small town in upstate New York, a town Frank, my old investigator, had confirmed was Rachel's last known location. The name on the label, written in a spidery, unfamiliar hand, read simply, "For Hope." My blood ran cold. I brought it inside and placed it on the kitchen table as if it were a bomb. It sat there, small and innocuous, yet radiating a palpable menace. This was her move, not a direct confrontation, but a subtle, insidious attempt to breach our walls. A Trojan horse wrapped in brown paper. I called the boys. They came over immediately, their faces grim. The sight of the box ignited the same argument we'd had when we first learned of her release. "We should burn it," Daniel said instantly, his voice tight. "Unopened. I don't want her poison anywhere near my daughter." "I don't know," David countered, his curiosity warring with his caution. What if it's an apology? What if she's really changed? Don't we at least have to see?" "See what, Dave?" Marcus shot back, exasperated. "Another lie? Another performance? It's a game. That's all it's ever been. By opening it, we're agreeing to play." They stood in my kitchen, 3 grown men, powerful and successful in their own rights, yet momentarily thrown into chaos by a 6x6-inch cardboard box. It was a testament to the deep wound Rachel had left. I listened to them, letting them voice their anger, their hope, their fear. Then, when they fell silent, looking to me for the answer, I picked up the box. It was light, insignificant. "She always wanted to be the center of our world," I said softly, looking at each of my sons in turn. "When she was here, she demanded it. When she was gone, her absence demanded it. Now, from a distance, she sends this little box, and here we are, letting it demand our attention, our anger, our fear. She is still trying to control the temperature in our house." I walked over to the hall closet where I still kept the old worn box that had once held the contents of the yellow envelope. I opened it. Inside were the faded documents, the grainy photos, the artifacts of a battle long since won. "Your brother is right," I said, turning back to them, the unopened package still in my hands. It is a game. But we don't have to play, and we don't have to destroy this out of anger. That would still be giving it power. It would mean we are afraid of what's inside. I looked down at the package. We don't need to know what's in this box. It could be a rattle. It could be a confession. It could be a curse. It doesn't matter, because nothing in this box can ever be more powerful than what is already in this house. The love, the family, the life we built, that is the truth. This, I said, holding up the package, is just noise. And with that, I placed the unopened package gently into the box of evidence. I was not hiding from it. I was archiving it. It was just one more piece of a story that was already over, a final, pathetic postscript that we would not allow to become a new chapter. I closed the lid and slid the box back into the quiet darkness of the closet. A profound sense of peace settled over the room. The tension broke. My boys looked at me, then at each other, and the anger in their eyes was replaced by a familiar, solid love. The ghost had been acknowledged, and then, quietly and deliberately, it had been dismissed. 1 year later, our house was filled with balloons and laughter for Hope's first birthday. She toddled around the living room, a blur of pink tulle and happy shrieks, her grandparents, uncles, and aunts doting on her every move. As I watched Daniel lift his daughter high into the air, her giggles echoing off the walls Marcus had painted, I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated victory. It wasn't the fiery, vindictive victory of the courtroom. It was something deeper, quieter, and infinitely more powerful. It was the victory of a garden in full bloom. It was the victory of a Sunday dinner. It was the victory of a baby named Hope, taking her first wobbly steps into a future that was bright, safe, and filled with a love that had proven, once and for all, to be unbreakable. The years spun by, each one a thread of gold woven into the tapestry of our peaceful life. Hope, my great-granddaughter, grew from a toddling baby into a bright, inquisitive little girl of 5. She was the heart of our home, a whirlwind of crayon drawings, scraped knees, and questions about everything from why the sky was blue to why my hair was the color of snow. She had my quiet resilience, Daniel's steady gaze, and a joy for life that was entirely her own. She was the living embodiment of our family's victory, a daily beautiful reminder that life, when nurtured with love, will always grow toward the light. Our Sunday dinners remained our most sacred ritual. The house would fill with the happy chaos of family. Daniel and Sarah, Marcus and Elena, and David, who had recently announced his engagement to a kind-hearted nurse from his hospital. They would all gather, their lives full and successful, but their hearts still anchored to the small brick house in Forest Hills. We were a constellation, each of us a bright, shining star, but connected by an invisible, unbreakable gravitational pull. I would watch them, my heart a vessel overflowing with a quiet, profound gratitude. The ghosts of the past had long been vanquished, not by fighting them, but by building a present so full of light that they simply had no shadows in which to hide. The final echo from that past arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. The air was crisp, and the leaves in my garden were a riot of red and gold. The phone rang, a shrill interruption to the quiet morning. It was not a number I recognized. The voice on the other end was professional, dispassionate, a public administrator from a rural county in upstate New York. He was calling, he explained in a detached, bureaucratic tone, to inform the next of kin of the passing of a Ms. Rachel Evans. I sat down in my armchair, the receiver cold against my ear. He continued speaking, mentioning details about an unattended death, the lack of a will, the need to handle her minimal effects. I heard the words, but they seemed to be coming from a great distance. There was no shock, no surge of grief. There was only a profound, heavy stillness, the kind that comes after a long and brutal storm has finally, truly moved out to sea. It was the sound of a final door clicking shut, a door I had thought was already sealed, but now was irrevocably locked. "Thank you for informing me," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the man's on the other end of the line. I took down the information he provided, promised to confer with my family, and hung up the phone. I sat there for a long time, looking out at my garden. The vibrant colors of the autumn leaves seemed brighter, the crisp air cleaner. It wasn't relief, not in the triumphant sense. It was simpler than that. It was the feeling of a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying being gently lifted from my shoulders. The just in case that had lived in the back of my mind for so many years, the fear of a sudden reappearance, another desperate plea, another manipulative scheme, was finally gone. The story was over. That evening, I gathered my sons. They sat in my living room, the same room where they had grown from boys into men, and I told them. I delivered the news just as it had been delivered to me calmly, factually. Their reactions were as unique as they were. Daniel, my protector, let out a long, slow breath. The tension visibly drained from his shoulders. His first emotion was closure, the final certain knowledge that the threat to his family was gone forever. "Okay," he said quietly, nodding. It was all he needed to say. Marcus, my artist, stared down at his hands, his expression one of a deep, complicated melancholy. I knew he wasn't mourning the woman she had been, but the idea of the mother she never was, a sadness for the empty space, the wasted life. David, my healer, was the one who voiced the question that hung in the air. "Was she alone?" he asked, his voice soft. As a doctor, he had sat with the dying. He had held the hands of strangers. The thought of anyone, even Rachel, leaving this world without a hand to hold pained his compassionate soul. "I believe so," I answered gently. "The administrator said she was found in her apartment. It seems she had been ill for some time." They were silent for a long while, each lost in his own thoughts, processing the final severing of a tie that had defined so much of their young lives. The anger was gone, burned out long ago. What remained was a complex tapestry of old hurts, quiet sadness, and a vast, overriding sense of peace. It was David who spoke next, his eyes finding mine. "That box," he said, "the one she sent for Hope, we never opened it." A silent understanding passed between us. The box was no longer a threat. It was not a Trojan horse. It was simply the last testament of a woman who was no longer here. It could hold no more power over us. I went to the hall closet and retrieved the old storage box, the one that held the remnants of our past battle. And inside, resting atop the yellowed legal documents, was the small, brown paper-wrapped package. I brought it into the living room and placed it on the coffee table. It seemed so small, so pathetic. "Whatever is in this box," I said, looking at my sons, "it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change who we are. It's just the last page of her story." With steady hands, I carefully untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was a small silver-plated baby rattle, the kind you could buy in any department store. Tucked alongside it was a greeting card with a picture of a cartoon stork on the front. We opened it. The pre-printed message inside read, "A new little treasure to love and adore." And beneath it, in Rachel's spidery, unfamiliar handwriting, was a short, chilling note. It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was the final, perfect distillation of her character. It read, "I hope your new little girl brings you joy. Maybe one day you will tell her about her real grandmother, the one who loves her even though she was kept away." A collective sigh seemed to pass through the room. It was not a sigh of anger, but of sad, final confirmation. Even at the end, she had been incapable of seeing beyond herself. It was a last weak attempt at manipulation from beyond the grave, a final self-pitying barb designed to cast herself as the victim. In that moment, any lingering what-ifs, any microscopic shred of doubt David might have harbored about her capacity for change, vanished completely. She had never changed. Our decision to build a wall around our family had been the right one, the only one. Daniel reached out and closed the card. "Well," he said, his voice flat but calm, "now we know." We sat there, the four of us, looking at the cheap rattle and the manipulative card. There was no more to say. The last question had been answered. "There will be no funeral for us to attend," I said quietly. "We said our goodbyes to her a long time ago. Her service is not for us." They all nodded in agreement. Our mourning, what little there was for a ghost, not a person. The next Sunday, they all came for dinner, as always. But this time, they brought their wives, and Daniel and Sarah brought Hope. The house was filled not with a heavy silence, but with the vibrant, life-affirming sounds of family. Hope, now old enough to help, stood on a stool beside me at the counter, carefully stirring a bowl of brownie batter, her small face a study in concentration. Later that afternoon, I was in the garden, showing her how the last of the autumn roses were still clinging to their branches. She reached out with a tiny finger and gently touched a velvety red petal. "Is it magic, Grandma Carmen?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. I smiled, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. I knelt beside her, the cool earth beneath my knees, and wrapped my arm around her small shoulders. "Yes, my love," I whispered, pulling her close. "It is." In that moment, I understood Rachel's true legacy. It wasn't the pain, the abandonment, or the years of struggle. That was her story, not ours. Her true, unintended legacy was this unbreakable family, this fierce, protective love, this little girl named Hope, touching a rose in a garden that love had built. She had forced us to learn the hardest and most beautiful lesson of all, that the families we choose, the ones we build and fight for and show up for every single day, are the ones that are truly magic. Our story had not been defined by its bitter beginning, but by the sweet, resilient, and beautiful ending we had written for ourselves. The news of Rachel's passing did not shatter our peace, but it did change the air, subtly, like a shift in barometric pressure before a distant rain. It wasn't a cloud of grief that settled over us, but a quiet, contemplative haze. The finality of her death had closed a book we'd long since put on the shelf. The story was over, the antagonist gone. What we were left with was the silence of her complete and total absence, a void that was, in its own way, more profound than the 15 years of wondering had been. Life, however, is relentless in its forward march. Our Sundays continued, the rhythm of our lives held steady by the happy chaos of family. Hope was now a bright spark of a girl, full of laughter and endless energy. Her presence a constant, vibrant reminder of the future we had built. The boys, my strong, good men, seemed to have put the news behind them, their focus firmly on their wives, their careers, and the beautiful life we all shared. Yet I could feel the unasked questions lingering beneath the surface, the last few threads of a story that still needed to be tucked away. The final thread arrived 2 weeks later, not as a phone call, but as a large, sterile-looking cardboard box delivered by a courier. It was from the public administrator's office in the county where Rachel had died. Taped to the top was a formal letter explaining that these were the personal effects of the deceased, forwarded to the next of kin as required by law. The box sat on my porch, an unassuming square of brown cardboard that held the sum total of my daughter's life. I didn't bring it inside right away. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the official tape sealing the flaps, and felt a weariness that had nothing to do with my age. This was it, the final piece of her, the last echo. I knew I could not and should not face this alone. That evening, we gathered once more in my living room. The box sat on the floor between us, an object of intense, silent gravity. It was different from the last package she had sent. That one had been a weapon, a final, manipulative jab. This was just wreckage. The sad, unclaimed debris left behind after a ship has sunk. "We don't have to open it," Daniel said, his voice low and firm, his protective instincts on full alert. "We can dispose of it. We don't owe her this." "But what if we do?" David countered, his healer's heart always searching for a deeper meaning. Not for her, for us. To see it through to the absolute end. To know that there are no more secrets, no more surprises. To be able to say we saw the whole story. Marcus, my thoughtful, artistic son, nodded slowly. "He's right," he said. "I don't want to live the rest of my life wondering what was in that box. I want to know. I need to see what a life without us looked like." So the decision was made, not with fear or anger, but with a quiet, solemn resolve. This was not about her. It was about us. It was about closing the file for good. I knelt down, and with a small pair of scissors, I carefully cut the official tape. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. The contents were not dramatic. There was no hidden fortune, no shocking confession in a sealed letter. What was inside was infinitely sadder. It was a collection of profound emptiness. There were a few items of cheap, tarnished jewelry, a handful of worn-out paperbacks, a stack of unpaid bills and threatening letters from collection agencies. It was the anatomy of a lonely, desperate life. Then we found a smaller, shoebox-sized container tucked in the corner. I lifted the lid and we all leaned in. Inside was a collection of photographs, loose and jumbled. The first few were of Rachel herself, taken years ago. There she was as a teenager, defiant and beautiful, with a rebellious smile that I remembered with a pang of ancient sorrow. There was another of her holding a newborn Daniel, her face soft with a fleeting, genuine wonder. It was a picture of a girl who had once held a universe of potential in her hands, a life that could have been so different. For a fleeting second, I mourned that girl, the one who had been lost so long ago. But as we sifted deeper, the nature of the collection changed. The rest of the photos were not of her. They were of us. They were candid, long-lens shots, clearly taken from a distance. There was a blurry picture of Marcus walking across his college campus, his art portfolio tucked under his arm. There was a photo of David in his scrubs, laughing with a colleague outside the hospital. There was a grainy picture of Daniel and Sarah's wedding, taken from across the street, capturing the moment they emerged from the church. My blood ran cold. She hadn't just been monitoring us online. At some point, she had been physically there, a ghost on the periphery of our lives, watching from the shadows. It wasn't the act of a mother trying to reconnect. It was the act of a stalker, an obsessive observer who saw them not as sons to be loved, but as possessions to be tracked. And then we found the last items, tucked at the very bottom of the shoebox. A thick stack of newspaper clippings, carefully cut out and yellowed with age, held together by a brittle rubber band. We slid the band off, and the clippings fanned out across the coffee table. They were all from the local Queens newspaper. An announcement of Daniel's graduation, with his name circled in red ink. A small article about an art show featuring Marcus's work, a notice from the hospital congratulating David on matching for his residency. She had followed their successes, their triumphs, every public mention of their names. She had collected the proof of the good men they had become, not with a mother's pride, but with the chilling, proprietary air of a collector. It was the final, damning piece of her psychological puzzle. She had not loved them. She had been obsessed with the idea of them, with the life she had thrown away and felt she was owed. These clippings were her trophies, proof of the legacy she felt had been stolen from her. In that moment, we all understood. She hadn't wanted to be in their lives. She had wanted to own their lives. David sat back, his face pale but his eyes clear. The last flicker of pity, of wondering if she had ever truly changed, was gone. My God, he whispered. It was never about us. It was always only about her. Daniel nodded, a grim finality on his face. This proves it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This proves that keeping her out wasn't just the right choice. It was the only choice. We were protecting ourselves from this sickness. We packed everything back into the box. The cheap jewelry, the sad photos, the obsessive clippings. We taped it shut, not with the sterile seal of the state, but with our own brown packing tape, sealing the sad, empty story within. There would be no more analysis, no more discussion. We had seen what we needed to see. We can't keep this in the house, Marcus said, his voice firm. But burning it feels too violent, too angry. It's not worth that much of our energy. I knew what we had to do. There is a place for things that are over, I said softly. A place where old things can be returned to the earth and, in time, become something new. The next afternoon, we all went out into my garden. The late autumn sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. In a far corner behind the rose bushes, Daniel dug a small, deep hole. We didn't say any prayers or offer any grand speeches. There was nothing to eulogize. In silence, we lowered the box into the earth. As David and Marcus began to push the soil back into the hole, I looked at the faces of my sons. I saw no anger, no hatred. I saw only a profound, shared peace. They were burying the last remnants of a ghost, not with malice, but with the quiet dignity of survivors who were finally, completely free. Months later, spring arrived, breathing new life into the world. I was in the garden with Hope, the warm sun on our backs. We were planting a small sapling, a dogwood tree, a gift from David and his fiancée. Hope, with the solemn importance that only a 5-year-old can muster, directed me on where to dig. As it happened, the spot she chose was the very corner where the box had been buried. As I dug into the rich, dark earth, my shovel turning over the soil, I felt no trace of what lay beneath. The sad, empty story of a life wasted had been absorbed, reclaimed by the patient, healing power of the earth. It was gone. Hope placed the sapling's roots into the hole and began patting the soil around it with her small hands. When we were finished, she looked up at me, her eyes the color of a summer sky. "Grandma Carmen," she asked, her voice full of innocent curiosity, "will the tree be happy here?" I smiled, my heart full. I smoothed a stray piece of hair from her forehead and looked from her bright, hopeful face to the tender new life we had just planted in the ground. The past was beneath our feet, silent and transformed, and the future was right here in my hands. "Yes, my sweet Hope," I said, my voice thick with a joy so deep it felt sacred. "It will be very happy. Everything grows beautiful here." The final echo of Rachel's life faded not into silence, but into the vibrant, ongoing symphony of the life we had built. The earth in my garden, which had accepted the sad, small box of her existence, proved to be a place of astonishing grace. From that exact spot, the dogwood tree we had planted for Hope grew with a quiet, determined strength that felt deeply symbolic. Each spring, it would burst into a breathtaking canopy of white blossoms, a testament to the stubborn, beautiful resilience of life. It became our family's landmark, a living monument not to what was buried, but to what had been allowed to grow in its place. Time, once a slow and arduous climb, became a gentle, flowing river. I watched its current carry my family into new and beautiful seasons. Hope, my great-granddaughter, was the brightest of these seasons. She grew into a girl of 7, with her father's steady eyes and a spirit full of my Marcus's artistic curiosity. My garden became her kingdom. It was there, amidst the roses and lavender, that I taught her the names of flowers, the patience of weeding, and the quiet magic of watching something grow from a simple seed. She was fascinated by the dogwood tree. She would sit under its branches for hours, drawing in her sketchbook or simply watching the way the sunlight filtered through its leaves. One warm summer afternoon, as we sat beneath its shade, she looked up at me, her small face serious. "Grandma Carmen," she asked, her voice clear as a bell, "why is this your favorite tree?" I smiled, my heart contracting with a familiar, gentle ache of love. How do you explain a history of pain and survival to a child who has only ever known safety? How do you describe a storm to someone who has only ever felt the sun? "Well, my love," I began, choosing my words with care as I smoothed her hair, "this tree is special because it reminds me of something very important. It reminds me that even when you put something sad and broken into the ground, if you cover it with enough love and give it enough time, something strong and beautiful can grow in its place." She considered this with the profound gravity of a 7-year-old philosopher. "So it's a magic tree," she concluded, her eyes shining with understanding. "Yes," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "It's the most magic tree I know." The culmination of this long season of peace was David's wedding. My youngest, my healer, was marrying a wonderful woman named Maria, the kind-hearted nurse who shared his quiet strength and deep well of compassion. The wedding was to be held in my garden, a place that had become the heart of our family, the living, breathing symbol of our roots. The weeks leading up to it were a joyful whirlwind. My house, which had once felt cavernous in its quiet, was now constantly filled with the happy chaos of planning. My daughters-in-law, Sarah and Elena, would sit at my kitchen table for hours, debating flower arrangements and menu choices. My sons would be in the yard, stringing lights through the branches of the trees and building a small, elegant archway under which the couple would stand. Watching them, I saw not just a family preparing for a wedding, but the living, breathing result of a choice I had made so long ago. I saw Daniel, the responsible engineer, meticulously measuring the supports for the archway, ensuring it was safe and strong, the protector still. I saw Marcus, the artist, directing the placement of the lanterns, his eye for beauty turning my simple garden into a fairy tale landscape. And I saw David, his face alight with a calm, radiant happiness. His hand always finding Maria's, a man who was ready to build his own sanctuary of love because he had always known what one felt like. The evening before the wedding, as the last of the preparations were finished, David found me sitting alone on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and rose. He sat down beside me, the swing moving in a slow, comfortable rhythm. "It's perfect, Mom," he said softly, looking out at the transformed garden. "Everything is perfect." "You are happy, my son," I replied. "That is what makes it perfect." He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to me, his eyes holding a depth of emotion that needed no words. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice low, "about everything, about how none of this, the garden, the house, Marcus and Daniel, me, none of us would be who we are without you. You didn't just save us, Mom. You built us. You took the broken pieces of another person's life and you built us a world." Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, but I held them at bay. "I used to feel angry," he confessed, a look of old pain flickering briefly in his eyes. "And then, for a long time, I just felt sad. But now I just feel grateful. She gave me life, it's true. But you, Mom, you taught me what to do with it." He reached out and took my hand, his own so large and capable now, the hand of a man who healed others. "I just want you to know," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "as I start my own family tomorrow, the only thing I hope for is that I can be half the parent to my children that you were to us." In that moment, under the fading light of the setting sun, I felt the last tiny, lingering ache in my heart dissolve completely. The questions of what if, the ghosts of a life that might have been, were gone. This was my validation. This was my reward, not the verdict in a courtroom, not the victory over a broken woman, but this, the quiet, heartfelt gratitude of a good man on the eve of his own happiness. The wedding day was perfect. The sun shone brightly, the garden was a symphony of color and scent, and Hope, in a small white dress, took her role as flower girl with a seriousness that made everyone smile. I sat in the front row between Daniel and Marcus and watched my youngest son marry the love of his life under the archway his brothers had built. As they exchanged their vows, their voices clear and full of promise, my mind drifted back to another day in another official room. I thought of the sterile courtroom, the ugly accusations, the heavy weight of the yellow envelope in my hands. That envelope had been my weapon, my shield, my proof. It had been filled with the evidence of a life of struggle, of showing up, of fighting a silent, lonely war. Now, I looked around me. I saw Daniel with his arm around a pregnant Sarah. Their second child was on the way. I saw Marcus holding hands with Elena, their faces a picture of contentment. I saw Hope, her basket empty of petals, now chasing a butterfly near the dogwood tree. I saw the faces of friends and family, all gathered not to witness a fight, but to celebrate a union. This, I realized, was the true evidence. This was the final verdict. My family. This was the real inheritance I had fought to protect, not the money Rachel had craved, but this priceless, unshakable foundation of love. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed and the house had settled back into its peaceful quiet, I walked out into the garden one last time. The white paper lanterns, still glowing in the dark, cast a soft, magical light on the flowers and trees. I went to the dogwood tree, its blossoms almost luminous under the moonlight, and placed my hand on its smooth, strong bark. I thought of Rachel, not with anger, not even with pity anymore, but with a distant, final sense of peace. Her life had been a story of taking, of demanding, of leaving empty spaces. My life, I realized, had been about filling them. It had been about tending a garden, both literally and figuratively. It had been about understanding that family is not something you are given, but something you build. It's a choice you make. Over and over again, every single day, it's the choice to stay. I thought of the unopened package we had buried here, and the sad, manipulative card inside. "I hope you will tell her about her real grandmother," she had written. And I smiled to myself in the quiet dark, a small, knowing smile of profound and final peace. I would tell Hope stories. I would tell her about the grandmother who sat with her in the garden, who taught her the names of the stars, who held her hand when she crossed the street. I would tell her about the love that built this house, that planted this tree, that held our family together like the roots of an ancient oak. I would tell her the truth. I was her real grandmother, and this beautiful, vibrant, love-filled life was the only story that mattered. The years after David's wedding were the golden ones, the season of reward. The river of time, which had once been a turbulent, dangerous current I fought just to stay afloat, slowed to a gentle, meandering stream. It carried us all forward, not with the violence of change, but with the quiet, inexorable grace of growth. My world, which had once been defined by the 4 cramped walls of a queen's apartment and the constant gnawing anxiety of survival, had expanded to encompass a universe of simple, profound joys. The family continued to blossom. Daniel and Sarah welcomed a son, naming him Richard, after the grandfather he would never know, but whose quiet strength I had so often described. Marcus and Elena, after years of focusing on their careers, adopted a bright, beautiful little girl from Colombia, adding a vibrant new thread to our family tapestry. My house, my wonderful, sturdy brick house became the epicenter of a sprawling, happy clan. Sundays were no longer just dinners. They were grand, chaotic, multi-generational affairs with toddlers underfoot, teenagers debating music at the kitchen table, and my sons, now firmly in their middle years, their faces etched with the handsome lines of experience and contentment, still arguing over sports. I transitioned into the role of matriarch with a quiet, joyful ease. I was no longer the warrior, no longer the protector on high alert. My battles were long since won. Now I was the keeper of our story, the anchor, the quiet center around which my bustling, beautiful family orbited. My days were measured not by deadlines or bills, but by the slow, satisfying rhythms of my garden. I would spend my mornings with my hands in the earth, a practice that felt more like prayer than work. I learned the personalities of my plants, the proud, dramatic flair of the peonies, the quiet resilience of the lavender, the steady, unassuming strength of the old oak at the edge of the yard. The dogwood tree, planted over the grave of our family's painful past, grew tall and majestic. It became a living calendar, its bare winter branches a promise of rest, its glorious spring blossoms a symbol of renewal, its lush summer shade a haven of peace, and its vibrant autumn leaves a lesson in the beauty of letting go. My grandchildren, all three of them now, played beneath its branches. They would have picnics in its shade, hang swings from its sturdy limbs, and whisper their secrets to its leaves. They knew it only as the magic tree, a place of joy and imagination. They had no idea of the sorrow buried deep beneath its roots, and that, I knew, was the greatest victory of all. The past had been so completely transformed into a foundation for the present that it had lost all its power to cause pain. It was simply earth, rich and fertile, from which new life could grow. As I moved deeper into my 70s and then into my 80s, my steps grew slower, but my heart grew lighter. The boys and their wives, ever watchful, tried to shield me from any and all burdens. They hired a local teenager to help with the heavy lifting in the garden and a cleaning service to manage the house. I accepted their help with grace, understanding that their need to care for me was the reflection of the care I had once given them. It was the beautiful, natural closing of a circle. One crisp autumn afternoon, when I was 85 years old, I was sitting on my porch swing, wrapped in a warm quilt, a cup of tea steaming in my hands. Hope, now a thoughtful and compassionate young woman of 17, was sitting on the steps below me, sketching the changing leaves in her notebook. She was a wonderful blend of all my boys. She had Daniel's pragmatism, David's empathy, and her uncle Marcus's unmistakable artistic talent. She was preparing for college, her future a bright open road stretching out before her. "Grandma Carmen," she said, her pencil pausing over the page, "can I ask you something?" "Anything, my love," I replied, my voice a little thinner now, but still warm. She turned to look at me, her young face serious. "I was in the attic last week, looking for old photo albums. I found a box, a big cardboard box. It had legal papers in it, and newspaper clippings, about Dad and my uncles." She paused, her gaze steady and full of a wisdom beyond her years. "And it had a little baby rattle inside." I felt my breath catch for a moment, not in fear, but in recognition. The old box, the final remnants of a life that was not ours. I had nearly forgotten it was still there, a silent, sleeping dragon in the rafters of my home. "I know it's our story," she continued softly. "Dad told me the basics a long time ago, about my other grandmother, about how you raised them, but I don't think I ever really understood. Seeing that box, it felt real. It felt sad. I looked at this incredible young woman, my legacy, the future of our family, and I knew it was time. The story was no longer a weapon to be wielded in a courtroom, nor a secret to be buried in the garden. It was simply history, our history, and she was old enough to understand it, not just the facts of it, but the heart of it. Her name was Rachel, I began, my voice quiet but clear. She was my daughter, and for a very short time, at the very beginning, she was their mother. And so, on that golden autumn afternoon, I told her everything. I told her the whole story from the beginning. I told her about the ambitious, beautiful, and deeply unhappy girl her great-grandmother had been. I spoke of the abandonment, not with anger, but with a profound, aching sadness for a life so tragically wasted. I described the struggle, the fear, the loneliness of those early years. I told her about the yellow envelope, about the courtroom, about the moment I had chosen to fight back, and I told her about the box and the obsessive, tragic proof of a mind that could not let go of what it had thrown away. Hope listened, her pencil forgotten, her eyes never leaving my face. She didn't interrupt. She simply absorbed the story, her expression a mixture of sorrow, disbelief, and a fierce, burgeoning pride. When I finished, a tear was tracing a silent path down her cheek. "She never knew what she lost, did she?" Hope whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No, my love," I said, my own eyes misty. "She never did. She spent her whole life looking for something she thought the world owed her, and she never realized that everything she ever could have wanted was right here, waiting for her to simply choose it." Hope was quiet for a long moment, and then she reached out and took my wrinkled hand in her smooth, young one. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "It makes everything make more sense. The garden, the dogwood tree, the way Dad and my uncles look at you. It's not just love, it's reverence." She stood up and came to sit beside me on the swing, wrapping her arm around my shoulders. "You know," she said, a new firm conviction in her voice, "I think I know what I want to write my college application essay about." "Oh?" I asked, a gentle curiosity stirring in me. "Yes," she said, her eyes shining with a clear, powerful light that I recognized so well it was the look of a Morales who had found their purpose. "I'm going to write about gardens, about how some people are born into perfect, well-tended gardens, but how the strongest, most beautiful ones are the ones you have to build yourself, from the rockiest soil, with your own two hands." And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace so profound, so complete, that it felt like the final, gentle settling of the earth itself. The story was no longer mine to carry. It now belonged to the future. It had been transformed from a history of pain into a lesson of strength, a legacy of hope to be passed down to the next generation. My fight had been for them, for this moment, for this strong, wise young woman who understood the true meaning of our family's survival. I leaned my head against her shoulder, the warmth of the autumn sun on my face, and closed my eyes. The sounds of the neighborhood, a distant lawnmower, the laughter of children playing down the street, the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind, all blended into a perfect, peaceful melody. My long, hard-fought war had ended in the most beautiful way imaginable, in a quiet, sunlit garden, with my great-granddaughter by my side, secure in the knowledge that the family I had built from broken pieces was now, and would forever be, unbreakable. My work was done. The 5 years that followed my conversation with Hope on the porch swing were, without question, the sweetest vintage of my life. They were years lived not in the shadow of a past that had to be overcome, but in the full, warm sunlight of a present that had been earned. My body grew more fragile, my movements more deliberate, but my spirit felt lighter than it ever had. The ghosts had been laid to rest, the story had been passed on, and my only remaining job was to simply bear witness to the beautiful world my family had become. The occasion of my 90th birthday was the culmination of it all. My sons, in their typical loving fashion, would hear nothing of a small, quiet affair. They insisted on a celebration, a grand but intimate gathering of everyone we held dear, and it had to be in the garden. There was no other place it could possibly be. The garden was not just a location, it was the heart of our home, the soil from which our peace had grown. The day was perfect, one of those rare, flawless September afternoons where the sun hangs low and golden in the sky, and the air is filled with the sweet, nostalgic scent of summer, giving way to autumn. The garden was a masterpiece. Marcus and Elena had arranged everything with an artist's touch. With strings of fairy lights woven through the branches of the oak, and tables adorned with bouquets of late-blooming roses and hydrangeas from my own flower beds. The entire space hummed with the happy, bubbling sound of life, a melody composed of the laughter of my great-grandchildren, the clinking of glasses, and the warm, overlapping conversations of people bound by love and time. I sat in a comfortable armchair placed in a position of honor beneath the sprawling branches of the dogwood tree. From this vantage point, I could see everything. I watched my sons, now men in their late 50s, their hair tinged with the same silver as my own. They were the pillars of this family, each a different kind of strength. Daniel, the patriarch, moved through the crowd with a quiet, confident authority, his arm always ready to rest on a shoulder, his eyes always scanning to make sure everyone was happy. Marcus, the observer, stood a little off to the side with Elena, his gaze taking in the scene with a gentle, appreciative smile, as if he were composing a painting of this perfect moment in his mind. And David, the heart of our family, moved between groups, his laughter infectious, his presence a warm, healing balm, just as it had always been. I watched my grandchildren, now young adults, navigating the early stages of their own lives. Richard, Daniel's son, was a tall, serious young man with his father's engineering mind, deep in conversation with his cousins. Marcus's daughter, Sophia, was a firecracker, a vibrant soul who was planning a trip to her home country of Colombia to connect with her roots. And my hope, my thoughtful, brilliant hope, was home from her 3rd year of college, moving through the party with a grace and poise that made my heart ache with pride. This, I thought, as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the dogwood above me. This is the true inheritance. Not money, not property, but this web of love and connection, this living, breathing sanctuary we had built together. As the afternoon sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, soft shadows across the lawn, Daniel tapped a glass for attention. It was time for speeches. One by one, my sons stood before me, their faces illuminated by the golden light. Daniel spoke first, his voice steady and strong as always. "They say a person's character is their destiny," he began, his eyes finding mine. "But I think a person's foundation is their destiny, and we had the strongest foundation in the world. When our world crumbled, our mother did not. She became our bedrock. She became our architect. She drafted a new blueprint for our lives, one built on the principles of love, sacrifice, and unrelenting strength. Everything you see here today, every success, every happy marriage, every laughing child was built upon the foundation that she laid. We love you, Mom. You are the cornerstone of our lives." Marcus followed, his voice softer, more poetic. "As an artist," he said, "I've spent my life studying light. And the most beautiful light is the kind that shines in the darkest places. My mother taught me that. In a childhood that could have been defined by darkness, she was our light. She didn't just shield us from the shadows, she taught us how to find the beauty in them. She taught us that the most incredible things can grow from the most broken ground. She is the reason I paint. She is the reason I know that every canvas, no matter how damaged, can be turned into a masterpiece. You are our masterpiece, Mom." Finally, David stood, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My job is to heal. I mend broken bones, I stitch up wounds, I fight diseases. But the greatest healer I have ever known is my mother. We came to her as children with wounds you couldn't see on any x-ray. We had broken hearts, fractured spirits, and a sickness of the soul that comes from feeling abandoned. And with nothing but her own 2 hands and a love that was as powerful as any medicine, she healed us. She stitched our family back together, one loving act at a time. She didn't just save our lives, Mom. She made our lives worth living. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. My own tears were flowing freely, not tears of sadness, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. To hear my life, with all its struggle and sacrifice reflected back to me through the love in my son's eyes, was a gift beyond measure. But the final tribute, the one that truly brought the story full circle, came from Hope. She didn't make a speech. Instead, she walked up to my chair holding a beautifully bound book with a simple, elegant title embossed on the leather cover, The Gardener. "I got an A," she whispered, her smile radiant as she placed the book in my hands. It was her college essay, the one she had told me about years ago, now transformed into her senior thesis. She opened it to the first page. "I wanted to read you the dedication," she said, her voice clear and proud. She read, "For my great-grandmother, Carmen Hope Morales, who taught me that the most important work a person can do is to cultivate their own garden and to share its harvest with the ones they love." Then she turned a few pages. "This is from the introduction," she said, and her voice filled the quiet garden. "History is often told as a series of battles, of conflicts won and lost. But the most powerful stories are often quieter. They are the stories of survival, of growth, of creating life where there was once only desolation. My family's history begins not with a birth, but with an abandonment. It begins with a fight for survival. Symbolized by a simple yellow envelope full of evidence, a weapon forged from love and desperation. But that weapon, that envelope, was not the end of our story. It was only the seed. It was a seed planted in the rocky, broken soil of our past. And from that seed, a gardener, my great-grandmother, cultivated a family. This is the story of her garden." As her voice faded, a gentle hush fell over our family. The yellow envelope, once a symbol of our painful fight, had been transformed. It was no longer a weapon. It was a seed, a beginning. Hope had taken the ugliest parts of our past and reframed them, not as a source of trauma, a secret to be hidden, but as the source of our strength, our origin story. I closed my eyes, the weight of the beautiful book in my lap, and I felt it then. The final, perfect, peaceful release. The story was no longer just mine. It was ours. It was safe. It would be told and retold, not as a cautionary tale of betrayal, but as a triumphant saga of love. Later that evening, as the party wound down and the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, I remained in my chair under the dogwood tree. The lanterns cast a soft, ethereal glow, and the gentle murmur of my family's voices drifted from the house as they cleaned up, their laughter still echoing in the cool night air. The house was full. The garden was peaceful. My heart was overflowing. I thought about the woman I had been, the frightened secretary, the grieving widow, the overwhelmed single mother, the fierce protector in the courtroom. And I thought about the woman I was now, the matriarch, the storyteller, the gardener. It had been a long and arduous journey, but every step, every tear, every sacrifice had been worth it. They had all led me here, to this perfect moment of peace. A final gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the dogwood tree above me, and it sounded like a soft, contented sigh. It was the sound of a story finding its final perfect end. My work was done. My harvest was in. And in the quiet, gentle twilight, surrounded by the love I had cultivated, the gardener was finally and completely at rest. The years that followed my 90th birthday were like the final, slow, sweet notes of a beautiful symphony. The grand crescendos of conflict and triumph were past. What remained was a peaceful, resonant hum. My physical world grew smaller, my steps less steady. My days were spent mostly on the porch swing or in my comfortable armchair by the window, but my inner world had never been more expansive. I became a quiet observer, the gentle, steady sun around which my family's bustling universe continued to spin. The book Hope had written, The Gardener, became a treasured family artifact. It was not published for the world, but for us. She had several beautiful leather-bound copies made, one for each of my sons' families. It sat on their coffee tables, a quiet, elegant testament to our history. It contained our full story, told with Hope's clear-eyed compassion, the pain, the struggle, the courtroom battle, and the ultimate quiet victory of love. She had transformed our private history from a source of potential shame into a badge of honor, a foundational myth that explained not only what we had survived, but who we had become because of it. I found my final role in life was to be a living library for my great-grandchildren. Hope's younger brother, Richard, and Sophia, Marcus's daughter, were now teenagers, full of questions and grappling with the complexities of the world. They would often seek me out in the quiet of the afternoon, sitting on the floor by my chair, and ask me to tell them stories. They didn't just want to hear about the past, they wanted to understand it. "Grandma Carmen," Richard asked me once, his young face a mask of serious contemplation. "Were you ever scared? In the courtroom? When you had to fight her?" I looked at his earnest face, so much like his great-grandfather's, and I chose my words with the care of someone handling a precious, fragile thing. "Of course, I was scared, my love," I admitted, my voice a soft, papery whisper. Fear is a part of being human, but I learned something very important. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. I was more afraid of what would happen to your father and your uncles if I did nothing than I was of fighting. My love for them was bigger than my fear. Sophia, with her artist's soul, was more interested in the emotional landscape. "But weren't you angry?" she pressed, her dark eyes intense. "Didn't you hate her?" This was the harder question. I thought for a long moment, looking out at the dogwood tree, now a grand, sprawling presence in the garden. "Hate," I said slowly, "is a very heavy thing to carry, Sophia. It's like carrying a hot coal in your hand, hoping the other person will get burned. In the end, it only burns you. Yes, I was angry. Deeply. But over time, the anger faded. It had to, because I realized that holding on to it was like letting her still live in my house, rent-free in my heart. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about letting the other person off the hook. It's about letting yourself off the hook so you can be free. My freedom and your family's freedom was more important than my anger. These conversations became my final, most important work. I was no longer just tending the flowers in my garden. I was tending the roots of my family, ensuring they grew deep and strong, anchored in the truth of our past, but not tangled by it. I was helping them understand that the scars we carry are not signs of weakness, but proof of our ability to heal. As I approached my 95th birthday, I knew my time was growing short. The journey was nearing its end. I felt no fear, only a profound sense of completion, like a gardener at the end of a long, fruitful season, ready for a well-earned rest. But there was one last thing I felt compelled to do. I asked Hope to bring me my stationery and a good pen. My handwriting, once a neat professional script, was now a shaky, arthritic scrawl, but the words still flowed from a clear and steady heart. Over the course of a week, I wrote 3 letters, one for each of my sons. They were not letters of grand pronouncements or deathbed revelations. They were simpler than that. They were thank you notes for the lives they had lived. For Daniel, my steady rock, I wrote about strength. My dearest Daniel, the letter began. From the moment you were a small boy, you carried a sense of responsibility that was far beyond your years. You were the protector, the quiet leader, the one who always made sure the foundation was strong. You took the lessons of our struggle and built a life and a family of unshakable integrity. Watching you become a husband and a father has been the greatest validation of my life. You did not just survive, you thrived, and you built a legacy of stability and honor. Thank you for being the strong branch that held us all together. For Marcus, my dreamer, I wrote about beauty. My dearest Marcus, I wrote, where others saw only hardship, you always found the light. You had the soul of an artist, the ability to see the color in a world that often felt gray. You took the pain of our past, and instead of letting it make you bitter, you transformed it into art. You taught me that beauty is not just something you find, it is something you make. Your paintings, your beautiful family, the very way you see the world, they have brought more color and joy into my life than you will ever know. Thank you for showing me how to find the beauty in the broken places. And for David, my healer, I wrote about love. My dearest David, the last letter read, you were born with a heart full of compassion. Even as a little boy, you were the first to offer a hug, the first to sense a silent sadness. You took the wound of abandonment, and instead of letting it close your heart, you opened it even wider to the world. You chose a life of healing, of mending others, which was the greatest testament to your own resilience. You taught me the most important lesson of all, that love is the most powerful medicine in the world. It healed us then, and it is the gentle, steady heartbeat of our family now. Thank you for being the heart of our family. I sealed each letter and gave them to Hope. Give these to them, I told her, my voice weak but my instructions clear, after I'm gone, when the time is right. My final days were peaceful. I was not in a hospital, but in my own bed, in my own home. The window opened to the sounds and scents of my garden. My family was a constant, loving presence. They did not mourn around me. They lived around me. The house was filled with the normal, happy sounds of their lives, the chatter of my great-grandchildren, the smell of coffee brewing, the soft music playing in the living room. One afternoon, as I drifted in and out of a gentle sleep, I felt a small, warm hand slip into mine. I opened my eyes to see Hope sitting by my bedside, her book, The Gardener, open on her lap. I was just reading. "Grandma Carmen," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears she was trying to hold back. "The part about the dogwood tree." I smiled, a faint, tired smile. "It's a good story," I murmured. "It's the best story," she corrected, her voice breaking slightly. She squeezed my hand. "We'll take care of your garden," she promised. "Always." "I know you will," I whispered, my gaze drifting past her, out the window to the branches of the dogwood tree swaying gently in the breeze. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a quiet, joyful letting go. The gardener's work was finally, truly done. My legacy was not in the earth I had tilled, but in the hands that would tend it after I was gone. The story would continue. The love would endure. My last thought was not of the past, not of the courtroom or the struggle or the pain. It was of the future. I pictured Hope years from now, a grandmother herself, sitting under that same dogwood tree with her own grandchildren, the leather-bound book open on her lap, and I could almost hear her voice, clear and steady, carrying on the wind. "Let me tell you a story," she would say. "It's the story of a garden, and it begins with a seed." My great-grandmother, Carmen Hope Morales, passed away as gently as an autumn leaf detaching from its branch. It was not a violent tearing away, but a quiet, graceful release at the end of a long and fruitful season. She died in her own bed, in the small brick house that had become our family's sanctuary, with the scent of her beloved garden drifting in through the open window. In her final moments, she was not alone. She was surrounded by the symphony of life she had conducted, the distant laughter of her great-grandchildren, the soft murmur of her sons' voices from the living room, the steady, loving presence of my hand in hers. Her passing was not an end, it was a transition. The days that followed were filled not with the sharp, ragged edges of grief, but with a profound and shared sense of gratitude. The funeral was not a somber affair dressed in black, but a celebration of a life well lived, held, of course, in her garden. It was a perfect September day, the kind she had loved best. We gathered under the sprawling branches of the dogwood tree, our magic tree, and we did not mourn her absence. We celebrated her enduring presence. My father, my uncles, and I each spoke. We did not read somber eulogies. Instead, we read passages from The Gardener, the book that had become our family's sacred text. My father, Daniel, read the chapter about the courtroom, his voice steady and strong as he recounted the story of the yellow envelope, not as a weapon of war, but as the ultimate act of a mother's protection. My uncle Marcus, his artist's soul evident in his gentle cadence, read the passage about the small, cramped queen's apartment, painting a vivid picture of a home that, despite its lack of space and money, was overflowing with love and security. And my uncle David, his healer's heart in every word, read the final pages, the ones describing the peace Carmen had found in her final years, a peace she had cultivated as carefully as any of her prize-winning roses. As I stood before our gathered family and friends, holding the book she and I had in a way created together, I read the dedication aloud once more. For my great-grandmother, Carmen Hope Morales, who taught me that the most important work a person can do is to cultivate their own garden and to share its harvest with the ones they love. In that moment, surrounded by the literal and figurative harvest of her life, the words felt less like a dedication and more like a sacred vow. After the service, as the sun began to set, I found my father and my uncles sitting together on the porch swing, the same one where Carmen had spent so many peaceful hours. The air was filled with a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people whose hearts beat in the same rhythm. I approached them quietly and held out the 3 letters my great-grandmother had entrusted to me. "She wanted you to have these," I said softly. "She told me to give them to you when the time was right." One by one, they took their letters. The thick, creamy paper covered in her familiar, shaky script felt like a final, tangible piece of her. They opened them in unison, and as they read, I watched a lifetime of emotions play across their faces. I saw the stoic strength in my father's jaw soften, a single silent tear tracing a path down his cheek. I saw my Uncle Marcus's shoulders, which always carried the thoughtful weight of the world, relax as a gentle, bittersweet smile touched his lips. And I saw my Uncle David, my compassionate uncle, bow his head, his body shaking with a quiet, cathartic grief that was as much about love as it was about loss. They didn't share the contents of the letters with me then, and I didn't ask. Those words were theirs alone, a final, private conversation between a mother and her sons. But I knew with an unshakable certainty what those letters contained. They were not goodbyes. They were blessings. They were her final gift to them. The gift of seeing themselves through her eyes, of understanding not just that she loved them, but why she loved them. It was her final act of tending to their roots, ensuring they would remain strong and deeply anchored for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, our family did not drift apart. We did the opposite. We clung to each other and to the home she had created with a renewed sense of purpose. The small brick house did not become a sad, empty museum. It remained our heartland. My father and his brothers, now the patriarchs of the family, made a pact. They would keep the house jointly forever. It would be a place of pilgrimage, a gathering spot for holidays, a haven for any family member who needed a moment of peace. It was not a piece of real estate. It was the physical embodiment of our family's soul. And we all took our vow to care for her garden seriously. It became a shared, joyful responsibility. On the first Saturday of every month, we would all convene at the house for Garden Day. My father, the engineer, would meticulously prune the hedges and repair the trellises. My uncle Marcus, the artist, would arrange the flower beds, creating new palettes of color with each changing season. My uncle David, the healer, would gently aerate the soil and feed the plants, his nurturing touch as effective with roots and stems as it was with his patients. And I, along with my cousins and our own growing families, would work alongside them. We, the next generation, learned the names of the flowers. We learned the difference between a weed and a seedling. We learned the profound satisfaction of putting our hands in the same soil our matriarch had tended. And as we worked, we told stories. We kept her memory alive not by speaking of her in hushed, reverent tones, but by weaving her into the fabric of our everyday lives. Remember the time Grandma Carmen tried to teach me how to bake bread, and I used salt instead of sugar? My Uncle David would say, and we would all erupt in laughter. Remember how she would sit right there, my father would add, pointing to the porch swing, and she could tell just by the look on your face if you were telling her the whole truth? It was through these stories, this shared history, that we passed her legacy on to our own children. My son, Leo, and Richard's daughter, Clara, would play under the dogwood tree, the same way I once had, and when they were old enough, I would sit with them in its shade and open the pages of The Gardener. "Let me tell you a story," I would begin, my voice echoing the one I had heard in my own memory. "It's the story of our family. It's the story of a very strong woman, your great-great-grandmother. And it begins not with a castle or a kingdom, but with a small, simple seed of hope." One day when Leo was about 10 years old, he was helping me in the garden. We were planting new bulbs for the spring tulips. His small hands were covered in rich, dark earth. He looked up at me, his face full of the innocent, profound curiosity of a child. "Mom," he asked, "Grandma Carmen's mom. The one who went away, was she just a bad person?" I paused my digging and looked at my son. I thought of the box we had buried, the obsessive clippings, the sad, manipulative card, and I thought of the lesson my great-grandmother had taught me, the one about hate being a coal that only burns the one who holds it. "No, my love," I said, choosing my words as carefully as she once had. "I don't think it's that simple. I think she was a very sad person. She was like a plant that was put in the wrong soil, and she never learned how to grow towards the sun. She spent her whole life looking for something in the darkness, and she missed all the light. It's a sad story, but it's her story. It's not ours." I pointed to the tulip bulb in his hand. "Our story," I said, "is this. It's about taking what you're given, even if it's small and buried in the dark, and planting it in good soil. It's about having the patience to wait, the strength to protect it, and the faith to know that, with enough love and enough time, it will grow into something beautiful." He smiled, a look of perfect, simple understanding on his face. He carefully placed the bulb into the hole we had dug, and together we covered it with earth. In that moment, I felt my great-grandmother's presence as strongly as if she were standing right beside me, her hand on my shoulder. Her legacy was not in the battles she had won or the enemies she had vanquished. It was here, in this simple, profound act of creation. It was in the passing down of a quiet wisdom. It was in the hands of the next generation, learning to plant flowers in a garden that had been paid for, not with money, but with a love that was strong enough to turn the rockiest soil into a paradise. Her story had ended, but our garden, her garden, would continue to grow, season after season, forever. The seasons continued their gentle, cyclical dance, and our family, rooted in the rich soil of Carmen's legacy, grew and branched in ways that were both expected and wonderfully surprising. My son, Leo, and his cousin Clara, the fourth generation to find sanctuary in the small brick house, grew from children into thoughtful young adults. The garden, our shared inheritance, became the backdrop for every significant moment of their lives: first dates, graduation photos, and quiet, heartfelt conversations under the ever-watchful branches of the dogwood tree. The house itself, now over a century old, held the layered memories of our family like rings on a tree. In the attic, the box containing the yellow envelope and its sad accompanying artifacts still rested, not as a source of pain, but as a historical document, a foundational text. It was the genesis of our modern family, the hard, unyielding stone against which Carmen's strength had been sharpened. We did not hide it from the younger generation. We used it as a touchstone. When they were old enough, my father and then I would sit with them and tell the story, ensuring they understood that the peace they took for granted had been hard-won. One bright June afternoon, Leo, now a freshman in college studying history, came to me in the garden. He had a thoughtful, distant look in his eyes that I recognized instantly. He had been spending a lot of time in the attic lately, poring over the contents of the box with an academic's focus. "Mom," he began, his voice carrying a new maturity, "I've been thinking about great-great-grandma Rachel." The name, once a source of such turmoil, now landed softly in the peaceful air of the garden. It was no longer a curse, but a historical question. "I know her story," he continued, "and I understand why everything happened the way it did. But I keep wondering about her story. The one before us, what made her that way? What happened to turn a person into that?" It was a question we had never truly been able to answer. Carmen had spoken of her daughter's rebelliousness, her insatiable hunger for something more. But the root cause of that deep unhappiness had always remained a mystery, a blank page in our family's otherwise detailed history. Rachel had entered our narrative as a fully formed antagonist. Her motivations seemingly simple: selfishness and greed. But Leo, with his historian's mind, was searching for the nuance, the context, the story behind the story. His question planted a seed in my own mind. That evening, I called my father. I relayed Leo's question, and a long silence followed on the other end of the line. "You know, Hope," my father said finally, his voice heavy with a forgotten memory, "there was something. Something Mom mentioned, only once, a very long time ago. It was late at night, and we were talking after a particularly bad visit from Rachel, back when we were still kids. Mom was exhausted and her guard was down. She said something about Rachel's father, about Richard, my grandfather, the man I knew only through Carmen's stories as a good, kind man whose life was cut short too soon. What about him?" I pressed, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. "She said that Richard adored Rachel," my father recalled, his voice distant, "worshipped her. He thought she was perfect. And because he died when she was so young, she was frozen in his memory that way as a perfect, blameless child. Mom said that Rachel spent her whole life searching for that feeling again, that feeling of being the center of a world that asked nothing of her and gave her everything. She was looking for a love that wasn't real, because it had never had the chance to mature, to face challenges, to become a two-way street. Mom thought that was the root of it, the great tragedy of her life. The pieces clicked into place with a sudden, breathtaking clarity. It wasn't just selfishness, it was a profound, arrested development. Rachel had been chasing the ghost of a perfect, unconditional love that only a doting father can have for his little girl, a love that had been snatched away before it could evolve into the more complex, demanding love of adulthood. She'd spent her life punishing the world, and especially her own mother, for not being him. She had abandoned her own children because they, too, demanded a real, sacrificial love she was incapable of giving. She could only receive. She had never learned how to give back. This revelation did not excuse her actions. It did not absolve her of the pain she had caused, but it did something just as important. It made her human. It transformed her from a one-dimensional monster into a tragic figure, a woman broken by a loss so profound it had warped the entire trajectory of her life. She was not the beginning of our family's story of pain. She was the second chapter of a story that had begun with my grandfather's untimely death. I shared this with Leo. He listened, his young face a mask of intense concentration, and I could see the gears of his historical mind turning. He was reframing the narrative, adding a layer of tragic depth that we had never fully considered. Our family's strength was not just a reaction to Rachel's weakness. It was a testament to Carmen's ability to break a cycle of trauma that had begun a generation before. Carmen had also lost Richard, but she had responded not by demanding from the world, but by giving to it, by pouring her love and strength into her grandsons. A few months later, Leo came to me with a proposal. His history department offered a grant for undergraduate students to pursue independent research projects. He wanted to apply. His project, he explained, would be a detailed multi-generational family history. He wanted to formalize our story. "It's not just our story, Mom," he explained, his eyes burning with a quiet passion. "It's a story about resilience, about how families are forged not by blood but by choice, about how the cycles of pain can be broken. I think it's a story worth telling." And so, with the blessing of the entire family, he began. He spent the next year conducting interviews, not just with my father and his uncles, but with old neighbors from Queens, with former colleagues of Carmen, with anyone who had known our family in those early, difficult years. He digitized the contents of the yellow envelope, preserving the grainy photos and faded documents. He created a detailed family tree, one that did not erase Rachel, but placed her within the context of her own tragic history. The project culminated in his senior thesis, a bound volume that was far more than an academic paper. It was a loving, meticulously researched history that honored every facet of our journey. He titled it simply, "The Gardener's Harvest." It was a companion piece to my own book, a factual, historical backbone to the emotional narrative I had written. Together, they told our complete story. On the day of his college graduation, Leo presented the finished volume to my father, my uncles, and me. We gathered once again in the garden. The dogwood tree was in full, glorious bloom, its white blossoms like a shower of confetti against the bright blue sky. "Grandma Carmen was the gardener," Leo said, his voice full of a quiet, powerful confidence. "And you," he said, looking at my father and his brothers, "are her harvest. The proof that her work was successful, and my generation, and the ones to come. We are the new seeds from that harvest. It's our job now to take the lessons of her garden and plant them in the wider world." In that moment, standing in the dappled sunlight, surrounded by the 3 generations of family that Carmen's love had nurtured, I felt a sense of closure so absolute it was like a physical release. The story had reached its final perfect evolution. It was no longer a secret, a weapon, or even a private history. It was a legacy, a teaching, a gift to be shared. My great-grandmother, a humble secretary from Queens who had wanted nothing more than a quiet, simple life, had, through an act of profound and desperate love, become the founder of a dynasty. Not a dynasty of wealth or power, but one of resilience, of beauty, and of hope. I looked at my son, a historian who now understood the deep, powerful currents that shaped the lives of his family. I looked at the garden, a living testament to the power of patient cultivation, and I looked up at the sky, a vast, open expanse of blue, and I sent a silent, heartfelt thank you to the woman who had started it all. Her final chapter was not the one she had written in her letters, nor the one I had written in my book. It was this one. the unwritten chapter, the one that would continue to unfold in the lives of her descendants for generations to come. The gardener was gone, but her garden, I knew with every fiber of my being, would flourish forever. This story is a powerful testament to the idea that true family is forged in the fires of love and commitment, not simply defined by blood. It shows that in the face of profound betrayal, one person's courage can break cycles of pain and cultivate a legacy of resilience. Carmen's journey teaches us that the greatest strength is often found in quiet, deliberate action, and that a life of integrity, sacrifice, and unwavering love can turn the most broken ground into a flourishing garden for future generations to cherish and draw strength from. Now, if you like this story, give it a like. Subscribe to the channel, and tell me which part surprised you the most. Each subscription and comment from you is a great motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful things in life. Thank you very much.